Good morning, everybody. And this is the third and final video for the Intro to Microbiology lecture. So today we're going to talk about how microorganisms are beneficial and how they are harmful. And we touched on a lot of this in the very first video. So it's just going to be a nice, quick and easy recap and some brief discussions on some of these ideas. So there are many ways that microbes are helpful. The first we talked about in the first video was that some microorganisms naturally produce antibiotics. Can you remember which scientist accidentally discovered penicillin? That would be Fleming. And so some organisms like fungus will produce natural molecules that are lethal to things like bacteria. And so we can cultivate those and put them in a form that humans can use, and it can help treat bacterial infections. Remember, antibiotics are not helpful against viruses. Remember, viruses are not considered to be living, and therefore they do not have some of the cellular machinery that antibiotics target. Because in a few weeks, we'll talk about how antibiotics work. And they normally target key cell structures like ribosomes, which make proteins. And by making ribosomes inactive, then the bacteria can't make proteins they need and they die, okay? So antibiotics, or antimicrobials, if we want to be even more big picture, target key cell structures and key cellular processes that bacteria need to survive. When we talked about the different types of microbes, we talked about how some fungi and bacteria are saprophytes, although we typically use saprophytes when we talk about fungus, and how they are decomposers, and they break down dead and decaying organic matter and recycle those nutrients back into the environment, which is very helpful. That has a big role in things like the carbon cycle, the sulfur cycle, and the nitrogen cycle, all of those fun cycles that we need to survive. Some microbes, especially bacteria, are used in sewage treatment or wastewater treatment. And there are different types of bacteria that have a role in this. So for instance, like aerobic bacteria, they require and use free oxygen that is already present in the water to help degrade various pollutants that are in that wastewater, and then they can also convert it into energy that they need to grow and reproduce. So they keep themselves alive during this process. But oftentimes, the wastewater treatment plant has to mechanically provide oxygen for this process to occur. Some anaerobic bacteria, and anaerobic means they don't require oxygen to live. Anaerobic bacteria are also used, and they're actually used to decrease the volume of sludge present in the wastewater, and they also produce methane gas from it, which is pretty neat. But we'll talk a little bit more about these guys later on in the course, but they just help break down some of the pollutants in wastewater so that it can be cleaned and used for human consumption or human use. Bioremediation, so if you look at that term, the prefix bio means living, and remediation, right? You're trying to solve a problem. And so this is where you are using living things to remedy a problem. And so the pretty common example of this is when there are oil spills, right? And all this oil goes out into the ocean, which is disrupting the aquatic environment. And you don't want to add more chemicals, right, to the ocean, which can also further, complicate things and kill organisms and disrupt the ecosystem. But it's really hard to get oil out of water. And so it turns out there are species of bacteria that naturally, quote unquote, eat or metabolize oil. And so we can add these bacteria to the ecosystem, and they will naturally eliminate the oil, and they do not produce any harmful byproducts. So it doesn't hurt the ecosystem at all, having these bacteria there. So it's pretty snazzy. For the next one, some bacteria can be used as a natural pesticide. There's a type of bacteria called Bacillus Thuringiensis. You don't have to remember that name, but it does use other microbes to help this. But what it does is it can naturally produce this molecule that naturally repels pests. And so you don't, or not you don't, but farmers and things don't have to spray chemicals to keep the pests away. This is just a natural way that it can be done, which is pretty cool. Let's see. Last but not least, the normal microbiota. So remember, there are organisms of all different types, bacteria, viruses, yeast, etc., that just naturally live on or within our bodies, and they help us with things like digestion. They also help prevent disease by making different parts of our body inhospitable to foreign pathogens. Some members of our microbiota, and in the lecture notes, they're also called the normal flora, but I will always refer to them as the normal microbiota. And the some members of our normal microbiota will produce molecules that are toxic to organisms that don't naturally live in that part of the body. And so when a foreign pathogen gets into our bodies, it can encounter these molecules and die. So it is a mutually beneficial relationship, right? A mutualistic relationship, the one between us, the host, and our normal microbiota. Just to kind of put a side note out there, remember there are 3 different types of host microbe relationships. So mutualistic, which is going to be between us and our normal microbiota. There are commensalistic relationships, which is where the microbe benefits, but the host is unharmed. The host isn't benefiting, but it's not hurting either. It's just kind of there. And then the last one, which is actually what we're going to go on to this slide, is a parasitic relationship, which is where the microbe benefits, but the host is harmed, right? So let's talk about some ways that microbes can be harmful. So I just talked about our normal microbiota, which are helpful, right? Organisms on and within our body. But sometimes those organisms can become pathogenic. Okay, when the opportunity arises, they become pathogenic, hence the name opportunistic pathogens. So a good example of this is going to be yeast. Candida albicans is the organism that we refer to as yeast. And Candida albicans is part of the vaginal microbiota. Okay, it's there along with lots of other bacteria and other organisms. But the bacteria that inhabit the vagina keep the vagina at a very low pH. And so it kind of keeps the amount of other organisms like yeast kind of in check at a very specific amount. But say this individual has to go to the doctor and they get antibiotics, right? We said antibiotics kill bacteria. So not only would they kill the bacteria that has infected that individual, but it would also kill some of the bacteria that makes up the normal microbiota, right? Because antibiotics aren't specific necessarily, not normally, for one type of bacteria. There are exceptions to that, but generally they target all the gram-positive bacteria or all gram-negative bacteria. So any gram-positive, for instance, bacteria that make up your normal microbiota might also be eliminated along with the pathogen. Well, when that happens, right, for instance, in the vaginal region, suddenly a lot of those bacteria that keep the vagina at a low pH are gone, right? So now the pH might increase. There's also just more space less competition for food. So sometimes those yeast cells, Candida albicans, are like, hey-o, look at all this space in this food, and now it's a better environment for us, so we're going to grow. And they do that, and they grow to unusual levels, and a yeast infection occurs, right? So that's a good example of an opportunistic pathogen, because normally yeast are in the vaginal region and they're fine. They're not causing any problems, no yeast infections. But when the opportunity arises, like you take antibiotics and wipe out part of your normal microbiota, they will take advantage of that. And then it leads to a yeast infection, which is considered a disease. And so now they are considered an opportunistic pathogen. All right, biofilms. So a biofilm is a mass of cells. They can be the same type of cell or organism, or they can be different types of organisms. As you see in this picture here, the different colored shapes represent different types of organism. But essentially what can happen, and we're going to talk more about this in future videos on prokaryotic cells. Some organisms have what's called a capsule, which is this sugary, sticky outer layer, and they are able to essentially attach themselves to surfaces, recruit other organisms to live there as well. And they kind of form this big mass of cells. And these can be problematic because in a hospital setting, they can clog catheters, they can clog heart valves, right? They can cause some pretty serious issues. It also turns out that biofilms, the community of organisms, can secrete this outer thick kind of protective layer. And there'll be a different picture in the next set of videos when we talk about this that shows you this outer kind of sticky protective coating that surrounds the community of organisms. And it can be really hard for like antibiotics, for instance, to penetrate that outer coating. And so the organisms that make up a biofilm can be harder to kill as well, just because it's harder for the antibiotics to, again, penetrate that thick outer coating. So biofilms can be pretty problematic for humans. As you've probably experienced before, if you leave bread or fruits and veggies or other food either out at room temperature for too long, or even in the refrigerator for too long, you will see some growth, right? A lot of time you'll get fungus growing on your food, and you don't want to eat that. Okay, at that point, it's gone. Okay, they are doing their job of breaking things down, but in this case, it happens to be your snack. All right, last but not least, infectious disease. Microbes can cause disease, right? Not all microbes, not all bacteria, not all, fungi, etc. But some can. And those organisms that can cause disease are called pathogens. So you definitely want to remember that. And all of Unit 4 is about various diseases of the various body systems. So we're going to talk a lot more about infectious disease later. So I'm going to go ahead and end this video here. If you have any questions, please let me know.